I'm Martha. Welcome to my sewing studio. Today I'm going to show you one of the most anticipated and frequently requested techniques from me. That's right, we're doing box pleat trim. This is a pretty straightforward fabric manipulation technique. Box pleat trim is very much what it sounds like. It is a trim made using box pleat. Traditionally, you'd make it using a ribbon or a strip of fabric. You do want something that presses well and that is relatively lightweight because you're going to be pleating it. You can attach box pleats anywhere on your garment. If you look at historical garments like Victorian clothing, it was popular at necklines, all over the bodices of dresses, or even a lot of them along the hem of a full skirt, which is a really beautiful treatment. Personally, I love adding box pleat to projects that use a printed fabric where the print is a little bit monotonous, by which I mean it's just kind of a small scale and it's flat, it's even across the surface of the fabric. And when you add things like tucks or piping or this kind of trim, you're adding texture, you're breaking up the print, and you're also adding just physical dimension, which is exciting to see in any garment. Whenever I make a garment with this technique, I get asked for a tutorial. So that's what we're doing today. I'm going to show you step by step how I make this trim. There are a few different ways to approach different stages of this. So I'm going to show you the way that I like to do things, but I will mention other ways you can approach it. So if you get to the pressing and you think, I would be more comfortable eyeballing this, or I would be more comfortable measuring this very, very tightly, you can do either one. I allow myself a little bit of wabi-sabi in this technique, and I think you can tell from the finished results that you probably won't notice. But that's up to you. If you need it to be super precise, I salute you. So without further ado, let's get into it and make some box pleat trim. My fabric today is a remnant of Liberty Tana lawn. This is left over from an old project. We don't need a ton of fabric to make this trim. You just need something quite thin so that all of the layers that build up as you're making this trim aren't too difficult to work with. For demonstration purposes, I'm making a 1-inch finished width of this box pleat trim. Usually I might do a 1/2 inch or 5/8 of an inch finished, but with 1 inch, it's really easy to do the math and you can easily see what I'm doing as I'm working, as it's not too small. Here's my fabric, and I'm going to cut a 2.5 inch wide strip. 1 inch for the front, 1 inch for the back, and then I'm sewing this as a tube, so 1/4 inch seam allowances times 2, that's a 1/2 inch. It'll make sense when you see me make the tube. So I'm going ahead and cut that strip on the straight grain. You can cut on the cross grain. I think you could probably cut on the bias, but I like that you don't have to for this trim because when you're cutting things on the bias, you use a lot more fabric than if you cut a strip on the straight grain. So here it is, it's 2.5 inches, and I'm gonna fold this right sides together, and then I'm going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm basically making a tube that I will turn right side out and then press flat. This will create a strip of fabric that I could use much as I would use a ribbon. You could, of course, also use a ribbon here, but I think when you have the matching fabric, it really makes it extra special. Now that I have that tube of fabric turned right side out, I need to make it flat. I also want to make sure that that seam line down the back is centered. So I'm going ahead and take this over to my pressing station, and we're going to iron this nice and crispy flat, as you can see here. In order to get that seam line centered, just use the nose of your iron and carefully press one edge. Because this is 1 inch wide, you can calculate it to be a 1/2 inch and then press the whole thing. You should now have a lovely crispy strip of your fabric. The front and back sides can easily be told apart because of that seam line, and that will be important later. Now I'm going to take a look at what a box pleat looks like. There's one pleat, and then we're going to form another one that's symmetrical. And that's it. That's a box pleat. We're going to create a series of these repeating down the whole strip of fabric or ribbon. There are 2 methods to achieve this, and here's the first one. We're using a jig. This is a piece of cardstock cut to the width of my finished box pleat, so in this case 1 inch. And then I've drawn a line down the center, so at the 1/2 inch mark. And as you can see, I can use this to fold my exact measurement of a 1/2 inch pleat. And then because this paper can be pressed, I'm going to go ahead and grab my iron and give it a nice hard press. You've probably heard the saying, sewing is pressing, and I'm here to tell you that making box pleat trim is like, I'm going to say 90% pressing. So get into it. We're going to do a lot of this. I am going to speed parts of it up, but I'm going to show the whole process. And I do want to say that I'm going to show another technique that's a little bit more wabi-sabi than using the jig, but I'll tell you why the jig is really excellent. Obviously, the accuracy and the crispness that you can achieve when using one is pretty clear here from the visual. But also, let's say you needed an exact measurement of finished trim length. Let's say you were going around a neckline and you knew you needed exactly 20 inches. You could calculate this out and make exactly 20 repeats. If you were eyeballing it, as I sometimes like to do, it might come out, a 1/4 inch plus or minus. Only you know if you can tolerate that, so make your choice and go from there. Now that we've covered the jig method, I'm going to dive into using just pins. This is how I prefer to work. It is a little bit more prone to error, or maybe I should just say irregularity, but I enjoy using pins with no jig. Now, since I've already used the jig to create some of these, I'm going to go ahead and pin those into place. But then moving forward, I'm going to discard that jig and just use pins. To do this, you're basically eyeballing. If you wanted to, you could easily keep a little ruler or seam gauge nearby and measure out a 1/2 inch. Sometimes I do that, and you know what? It didn't even occur to me to do that today. So that probably tells you a little bit about how I like to work. I like things to be neat and tidy, but I have my limits. And I want to note that what you've been watching with the pins has all been sped up 4x. So I'm not that quick. Once again, I want to give everything a nice hard press. So here comes the hot iron again. And I'll note I'm using glass head silk pins, so there's no chance of them melting. Make sure you're not using pins with a plastic head. You could just ruin your whole project with that. And if you're having any issues getting your pressing really crisp and sharp, or you're finding that the pleats are sort of undoing themselves, I want to recommend you use a clapper. A clapper is a piece of hardwood, and it holds in the steam and heat of the iron after the iron has been lifted, and it just sort of seals everything in. So if your fabric isn't taking a press, try a clapper. You might also need starch. I should have mentioned that earlier. Feel free to use starch. Personally, it's not my favorite. I don't like the residue it leaves on fabric, but a lot of people love it. So definitely something to have in your toolbox. I've removed my pins, and I'm just going to press it one last time so that edge where the pins were is crispy flat. We always want this nice and flat. It just makes things so much easier to work with, especially when we take this over to the sewing machine, which is where we're going now. And that hard press was essential because look what I just did. We really need the fabric to have that memory of the pleat in order to sew this. So don't stress out. If you've pressed it nice and hard, it's going to be good to go. Let's head to the sewing machine. First, let me show you our goal. We're going to have one line of stitching down the center of this, and the pleats will be secured. So with that in mind, we want to sew down the exact center of this 1 inch strip. I'm using the 1/2 inch markings on my stitch plate, knowing that the needle is at the center of that. So that means at the center of 1 inch. Then I'm going to use my fingertips and my awl, which is an indispensable tool for this, to carefully coax those pleats back into position. They should remember how they want to fold, and you can just hold them in place with your awl and then slowly stitch. This isn't something you're going to speed through. You're just going to methodically feed it through the machine. Another option you have is to pin all of your pleats in place and then remove the pins as you sew. Personally, I find doing it this way with the awl to be a little bit better of a workflow, but that's really for you to decide. So here I'm at the very end. I'm going to go ahead and sew it and then back stitch at the end to secure my stitching, and we're ready. We'll have this beautiful strip of fabric that can be made into box pleats. I always like to take a moment and really admire my work at this stage because I think it's already a beautiful object. The next step will be to hand sew these edges together to create the dimensional little rosette. You could also fold the corners together. You could fold all four corners together. You could do a mixture of these to create a pattern. We're going to need thread in a matching color, a hand sewing needle, and I like to use Thread Magic. You could also use beeswax or the thread conditioner of your choice. I don't always use something like this when I'm hand sewing, but I find that this task with the box pleat trim can be a little bit frustrating, and anything that I can do to reduce frustration is worthwhile. All right, I have a knot at the end of my thread and I'm going to start my work. I'm going to start at the back side and come up to the front in the center of one of my squares. You can see the position. And then I'm going to take a little bite out of one edge of a box pleat and a little bite from the edge of the box pleat on the other side. And as you pull those together, the two edges will lift up to create the rosette. Now, personally, I like to make one more little loop, one additional little bite out of both sides, and then pull my thread quite tight. You can see that I'm doing that here, and sometimes you do have to kind of wiggle your thread a little bit, so be patient, especially at the start. As you go, you'll get faster and more efficient. Now I'm going to take my needle and go through the center of that rosette through to the back, and I like to pull it kind of flat. I find this secures that rosette shape if I'm laundering the garment or anything like that. It just is really locked into that shape now. Now on the back side of the fabric, you could tie a knot here. Some people like to tie a knot here. I tend to just make one tight little stitch, which anchors my thread there. But again, if you want to tie a knot for extra security, you certainly can. Now you could tie a knot and cut off your thread here and start over. Personally, I like to go inside of all those layers of fabric, basically inside that tube that we made at the beginning, and just pop out 1 inch later, ready to do the next repeat. And I'm going to continue doing this process down the entire length of my fabric strip. This is a time-consuming part of the process. It's also repetitive and could be a soothing travel project, the kind of thing you bring on a train or an airplane. That's what I like to do with this. So think about it like that, as something soothing to pass the time. That being said, let's speed it up. When you've reached the end of your hand sewing, just tie a knot. I like to leave a long thread tail that I can weave in later when I've attached this to my project. I tend to hand sew this onto my garments. That way, if I ever want to remove it and reuse it somewhere else in the future, I can. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you loved learning how to make box pleat trim. If you have any questions or if there are other techniques you'd like to see me demonstrate, please leave a comment. I'm new to YouTube, so if you like this video and subscribe to my channel, it makes a huge difference for me. I'm going to link both my Instagram and my blog in the description box below. You can also find me in those places, and I will be back soon with another video. Thanks so much for being here. Bye.